ladies and gentlemen, this is the one before last session, and precisely because of that, we are going to fly in the extra atmosphere with you two, Madam Minister, Sarah Amiri, who is the Minister of State for Advanced Technologies, and she is the chairman or chairwoman of the Space Agency of the Emirates. So, Madam Minister, thank you very much for being with us. And I think it's also the opportunity for the two of you to meet with Philippe Baptiste, who is chairman, president, CEO of the Centre National d'Études Spatiales. And I think your presence also at the end of this WPC is of special significance because space, the space dimension was important in the Journée Française, the French Day of the opening of the Universal Expositions of Dubai. That was yesterday. Perhaps you will tell us 2 or 3 words on that. But I would like to ask you for the discussion one simple question. Nowadays, of course, everybody is interested in space. It's also it's a matter of technology, it's a matter of the future, the future, the world economy is going to space to be based on technology, and all technology today depends on space in some way or another. But the intriguing aspect of this is that, of course, the biggest countries, for them it is a major strategic issue, but middle powers also want to be part of this adventure, and they also want not to be entirely dependent on the biggest powers. So here we have, if I can say so, a big small middle power, and small big middle power, if I can use these terms. So I will start with you, Madam Minister. How can you explain us why the Emirates are so much involved in space activities? What difference does it make in the next 50 years? Whether you are involved in these costly, expensive activities, or if you were not, as most countries of your size. Please.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure being here with you. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to meet you for the first time as we lead both the space sectors in each of our respective nations. The space sector for the UAE, when we first advented into it, and it's a historic, I think, development over the course of the last 24 years, where we're users of space technologies, and in 2006, we transitioned into developers of such technologies, was for the core principle that we need to further diversify our economy. And if you need to further diversify your economy today, it means you need to have a strong base in science and technology. And what better and more challenging sector can you expedite the development of your technological capabilities in a short amount of time? And that's why the space sector was used from the get-go. Now, as we progress forward, so we're talking about 24 years of development from the space sector, from users of space technologies to developers of small satellite systems to developers of planetary exploration mission. We now look at the important factor that the space sector will play in our country's future. And that's the development of a private sector in space that adds on to our economy and then creates an amazing ripple effect into other sectors that utilize technologies. Today, we sit at a turning point where we have capable engineering capabilities to design and develop complex engineering systems. You require complex engineering systems, for example, to upgrade your existing industries. You require some skill sets that are available in the space sector, not only to develop your own space and technology capabilities in the private sector, but you're also able to develop them across other strategic sectors that require those technological advancements. When we talk about the next 50 years for the UAE and the next 50 years for the space sector in the UAE, we're talking about the advent of the increase of demand for the private sector. And we come at an amazing time where the private sector is getting more and more traction and is able to push forward, and it's the right time to enter into certain markets. So as we move forward, the role of the UAE's, the government of the UAE in the space sector is to develop the capabilities of the private sector and be able to transfer that knowledge and know-how and allow a lot of the capabilities that have been developed over the course of the last 20 years to start transitioning into the space sector, into the private sector. The private sector also requires a second primary component, demand. You need to start creating demand. So what we're doing with our future programs is to create business and provide contracts to the private sector to be able to flourish. So you're providing capabilities, you're ensuring that you have demand so that other sectors are taking on the products and services that are coming in from the private sector. You are upskilling your existing private sector by ensuring that they have access to contracts that allows them to deliver at higher and higher standards. And to bring all of that together, you need to ensure that you're continuously challenging yourself and moving forward. And the mechanism by which you challenge yourself is by bringing in exploration missions. If we talk about, so that's the play on the private sector. Then you talk about the ripple effect. If I go back a step, we said that the primary objective is to develop our science and technology capabilities. Space is quite aspirational. Living in a country that has sent a spacecraft to Mars is quite different than living in a country that hasn't done it. You've opened up an immense opportunities, and we lived through this year. We saw conversations changing in entire households in February of this year. We started this year with a skepticism of whether or not we're going to get to Mars. Come February, every single age group and every single household in this country spoke about the dangers of getting to Mars. That's a big conversation changer for you to be able to get scientific explanations and scientific objectives across and have the entire public root for it. For me, that was a monumental shift in creating the future generation, which will then capture on the development of the future sectors. Because a window of opportunity was open, and I was speaking earlier, this window of opportunity never existed for me. I never dared to say that I will work in the space sector one day, let alone work on a mission to Mars. This is not something that I thought was possible for myself or for anyone in my generation. But today, my children grow up in a world which this was okay, it's normal. They lived through it. They lived through an astronaut being put into space. They lived through science being something that's normal that you can go into and study. They lived through sending a spacecraft to Mars when you knew that maybe there's a 50% chance only of succeeding. And that gets me to my last point, which this creates a nice driver for, especially for you, like you said, nations that are advancing into technology. Technology is very risky, regardless of what stream you're going on. Space is, of course, the next level of risk. You change and transform an entire mechanism of thinking by using the space sector, where we've increased our appetite for risk. And I've experienced this in my daily job, where I can propose things that are quite risky and probably get approvals on it, because we have a better understanding on how to capitalize on risk and develop a mechanism by which you develop programs and projects and be able to get the maximum impact out of it. And that general understanding and balance between risk-taking, between appetite for failure, between what it means for success is what is needed during any transition of any nation that's going from a current economy that it has that's based on natural resources to an economy that's based on knowledge and know-how and experience, an economy that has risk as an inherent DNA of what you're doing. And now, those are several factors that the UAE has gone into space and will continue to invest in space over the course of the next decade or two to ensure that we're able to have a very robust and organically developed science and technology sector within the country.
Thank you very much. So your approach implicitly means that for you, one cannot become excellent in technology without the space dimension. Because after all, you could say that you can specialize or invest in various dimensions of technology, but not necessarily investing in space activities. So my understanding of your approach is that for you to be at the forefront of the understanding of technology, its implications, implies the space dimension. That's a statement and a question at the same time. But the other thing which I want to ask you immediately is, where do you draw the line between reality and dream?
So the answer...
I'm speaking of Mars in particular.
Yes. So the answer on the first question is, you can go about developing a science and technology sector within your country in different mechanisms. What space dimension brings in is speed by which you're able to develop capabilities. Because if you take developing a spacecraft, such as a mission to Mars, you get scientists that put your requirements. So you start creating opportunities for scientists to work in such areas. And then you also marry that with almost every field of engineering, from computer scientists and engineers, like the two of us here, to mechanical engineers, to people that are specialized in thermal systems, and so on. You're able to electronics and so on. So you're able to touch on multiple disciplines of engineering and use a new mechanism to do it. So the space dimension adds speed of development into it, which I think nations need to take into consideration, especially if they don't have a lot of time to transition and transform. That's where that decision comes. Now, where do you draw the line between science fiction, I'm assuming, and a dream, and going to Mars, for instance? The approach that we took, I think maybe when it was announced in 2014, seemed unreal. I think up to this year, for a lot of people that I had conversations off the record with, it was unreal. It was not something that, it was something that they classified as science fiction for us. But the approach that we took in development of this mission and the direction that was given was a very well-calculated one to not make it science fiction and actually make it realistic. And that's how you manage the design and development of this mission. The budget consideration, the time consideration, all these different factors that you surround the mission with. And then we went down the dimension of working with a knowledge transfer partner to develop this. And we worked together as one team. So it's the methodology that you take in designing and developing those missions that move it from the realm of science fiction to the realm of possibilities. And this is the mechanism that we've taken for several times. And I myself am taking a lot of this into my portfolio within advanced technology. Because the question for us in the Ministry of Industry and Advanced Technology is, how do you elevate your existing sectors by infusing technology? So a lot of those learnings you can actually take there. And how do you create new sectors that are based on technology within your economy? The space program for us is touched on a lot of mechanisms to be able to do that.
So I hope another time we will bring Ria, if we come back Ria for WPC, maybe you have an idea of a panel with the Minister of Advanced Technologies and the Minister of Tourism to develop tourism in Mars, on Mars. Wouldn't
you classify that as science fiction? Just a question to you.
We will see.
We will see.
Now I'm happy to give the floor to Philippe Baptiste, who has been now as I say, the boss of the CNES for what, about 6-8 months. So during those 6-8 months, I remember our first conversation, you had already some quite precise ideas, but I am sure that you have learned a lot in those months. So how do you answer today my simple question?
Merci beaucoup. Tout d'abord, je voudrais dire qu'en fait, je vais reformuler votre question. Puisque finalement, votre question, c'est pourquoi est-ce qu'il y a autant d'embouteillages autour de Mars cette année? Puisque si on regarde bien...
à cause de Madame Hidalgo. No, Madame Hidalgo is the mayor of Paris. She does not like cars, but maybe she likes rockets.
Je vais rester sur Mars. Mais bien entendu, il y a la sonde Hope des Émirats, qui est un très très beau succès, mais il y a aussi la sonde chinoise qui est arrivée quelques jours après. Il y a Persévérance, bien entendu, le rover américain, sur lequel je dois dire qu'on est très très fiers d'avoir fait la caméra, la tête là, de Persévérance. Puis il y a encore plein d'autres missions qui vont arriver. Ça aurait pu être Mars, mais on aurait pu aussi dire pourquoi est-ce que le trafic en orbite basse dans le spatial double tous les 2 ans, ou pourquoi est-ce que la plupart des agences de prévision sont en train de nous dire que dans quelques années, dans une quinzaine d'années, on aura quelque chose comme 3 000 ou 4 000 milliards de dollars par an de business autour du spatial. Donc, qu'est-ce qui se passe aujourd'hui autour du spatial? Alors, je crois qu'il y a pourquoi les gens vont dans le spatial aujourd'hui? J'aurais envie de dire le premier enjeu qui reste un enjeu, qui est là depuis très longtemps, c'est des questions de souveraineté, des questions de défense et des questions aussi de simplement montrer les capacités technologiques d'un pays, des enjeux de puissance en fait de l'ensemble des nations. Ça a été très vrai au moment de la guerre froide entre les Russes et les Américains. Et il semble assez clair qu'aujourd'hui, cette grande rivalité se redessine avec de nouveaux acteurs, mais en restant quand même sur les mêmes fondamentaux. Ça, c'est la première raison. La deuxième raison, qui me semble extrêmement importante, peut-être qu'on perçoit moins directement, c'est aujourd'hui les enjeux autour du climat. Vous savez qu'aujourd'hui, si on n'a pas le spatial, on n'est pas capable de comprendre et de mesurer les évolutions du climat. Plus de la moitié des indicateurs du GIEC qui nous permettent de suivre les indicateurs climatiques et de comprendre quelle est la santé de notre planète, ils viennent directement d'observations satellitaires. Et donc ça, c'est quand même un enjeu qui est aussi un enjeu majeur. La vérité, c'est que c'est pas ça qui explique l'explosion du nombre de missions, etc. Mais enfin, c'est quand même un enjeu majeur, et je voulais quand même le rappeler. Et puis, le dernier enjeu, qui est un enjeu qui est vraiment nouveau, qui prend une ampleur considérable, c'est les questions autour de l'innovation scientifique et technologique, mais surtout des questions de business, qui vont derrière, avec des pans entiers de l'économie qui sont en train d'être bouleversés par le secteur spatial et des enjeux donc économiques qui sont absolument colossaux derrière. Et c'est ça qui fait qu'en fait on a un ensemble de facteurs d'attractivité pour les nations vers le spatial. Mais alors, il faut essayer de comprendre malgré tout qu'est-ce qui s'est passé. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on a basculé dans ce nouveau monde où justement l'attractivité est beaucoup plus forte? Comme souvent, les raisons, elles sont quand même des raisons d'ordre technologique. Et ce qu'on voit, c'est qu'on a eu une multiplicité de grandes évolutions dans le secteur. L'arrivée du numérique, avec des méthodes de développement. Alors non seulement le numérique pour modéliser, pour réduire les temps de développement, pour aller plus vite, mais aussi de l'impression 3D, et aussi des techniques low cost qui viennent non seulement d'acteurs du numérique, mais aussi d'acteurs du monde industriel traditionnel, et tout ça, la miniaturisation des composants, pardon, et tout ça, qu'est-ce que ça a fait? Ça a baissé très brutalement les coûts dans le monde du spatial, pas dans tous les secteurs, mais dans un certain nombre de secteurs clés du monde du spatial, et en abaissant les coûts, eh bien, vous faites tomber en fait des barrières d'entrée qui auparavant bloquaient l'accès d'un certain nombre de pays ou d'un certain nombre d'acteurs économiques pour rentrer dans le champ du spatial. Aujourd'hui, vous êtes une compagnie privée, vous pouvez rentrer dans la grande compétition spatiale en lançant quelques nanosatellites pour quelques millions d'euros, peut-être quelques centaines de milliers d'euros demain. Donc vraiment, les coûts ont baissé considérablement. Alors, je dis ça, et juste quand même pour faire la balance immédiatement avec ce grand enthousiasme, n'oublions pas quand même qu'aujourd'hui, à l'instant T, je dirais approximativement 90% des crédits qui vont au spatial sont des crédits publics. On parle tous beaucoup de SpaceX, évidemment, qui est un acteur qui est passionnant et qui est extraordinaire, qui a bénéficié de subventions et de contrats du gouvernement américain qui sont absolument considérables, de l'ordre d'une dizaine ou d'une douzaine de milliards de dollars au cours des dernières années. Donc c'est à la fois un business qui est en train de décoller et de prendre une ampleur considérable et qui repose encore très largement aujourd'hui évidemment sur des financements publics. Alors ça permet quand même de voir une chose qui est quand même très intéressante. On a vu un monde très bipolaire au début, donc avec la Russie et les Américains, l'Europe qui s'est taillé une place, pas dans tous les secteurs. Par exemple, on n'a jamais trop regardé le vol habité, mais par contre, sur les lanceurs, on a été très très présent. Premier acteur privé, en fait, sur le monde des lanceurs avec le programme Ariane. Et puis, évidemment, nos champions dans le monde du satellite, hein, Airbus et Thales, sont quand même deux acteurs absolument extraordinaires, des acteurs français et européens absolument extraordinaires dans le secteur et qui sont les tout meilleurs dans un certain nombre de technologies satellitaires. Et puis, donc l'Europe a pris sa place, et puis là, on voit que progressivement, la Chine est rentrée dans le jeu, l'Inde est devenue un acteur majeur, et je passe évidemment d'autres pays. Israël a aussi un programme qui est tout à fait intéressant, bien entendu les Émirats, mais aussi on voit plein d'autres acteurs qui sont en train de rentrer. Et donc on rentre clairement dans un monde qui est alors à la fois multipolaire, c'est-à-dire avec beaucoup d'acteurs émergents, en même temps malgré tout l'accès aux lanceurs, qui reste quand même encore un élément déterminant de souveraineté pour un certain nombre d'États. Et donc, ça reste toujours un enjeu clé. Et je crois que l'Europe est très, très attachée à avoir un programme de lanceurs qui soit un programme de lanceurs qui garantisse un accès souverain à l'espace. Je reviendrai quelques instants après peut-être sur cette question des lanceurs. Mais voilà, donc avec quand même des pôles qui se dessinent, et puis une compétition qui est en train de monter en puissance à une vitesse absolument incroyable entre, d'un côté, les États-Unis, et puis de l'autre, la Chine, avec derrière l'Europe et la Russie qui soutiennent les différents programmes directement ou indirectement. Cette compétition, elle s'organise beaucoup autour de la Lune et Mars. Ma part de naïveté personnelle, c'est de regretter que quelque part, pour aller sur Mars, peut-être qu'on pourrait réfléchir à y aller tous ensemble. Je vais garder cette naïveté dans son coin. Mais moi, je pense toujours à l'exemple du CERN, que je cite abondamment. Le CERN, c'est ce grand centre qui permet de travailler, où on a fait la découverte du boson de Higgs, qui travaille sur de la physique des très hautes énergies. Et c'est un centre qui est vraiment... son motto, sa devise, c'est la paix par la science. C'est le fait d'arriver à mettre... alors je ne veux pas pécher par naïveté, et je vois bien évidemment toute la distance que ça peut avoir dans le monde du spatial, mais enfin, cet exemple est touchant et mérite quand même de temps en temps d'être rappelé. Le dernier point que je voulais mentionner, c'est l'Europe dans tout ça. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait aujourd'hui et qu'est-ce qu'on veut devenir demain dans ce monde du spatial qui est un monde multipolaire. Bon, d'abord, on croit profondément à l'importance du spatial pour toutes les raisons que j'ai mentionnées. L'accès à l'espace, les questions de défense, les questions de souveraineté, les questions d'observation de la Terre et du climat, les questions scientifiques qui sont absolument clés. L'Europe est un grand pays de science et on continuera à avoir des programmes qui sont très ambitieux sur un certain nombre de sondes ou d'instruments qui permettent de comprendre l'univers ou les grandes lois de la physique. Et puis aussi un programme de lanceurs qui est particulièrement important. Nous avons aujourd'hui un lanceur qui est, une gamme de lanceurs, hein, donc entre Vega et Ariane 5, qui est bientôt Ariane 6 dans quelques mois. Donc en 2022, nous aurons notre premier lancement d'Ariane 6, qui est un lanceur qui va permettre de remettre la France et l'Europe dans la compétition mondiale des lancements, avec, je l'espère, je le souhaite. Il faut toujours toucher du bois quand on parle du monde des lanceurs, parce que un lanceur, c'est quand même un instrument très très compliqué qui travaille à la frontière des lois de la physique. On n'est jamais à l'abri, donc des premiers lancements qui vont arriver bientôt, et puis Ariane 6 qui va bénéficier évidemment de toute l'expérience du programme Ariane en termes de robustesse et de fiabilité, et puis avec des coûts qui sont bien inférieurs à ceux d'Ariane 5, et qui seront, et ça je pense que c'est important de le dire, qui seront dans le marché. Bien entendu, on a une formidable compétition avec SpaceX qui continue et qui s'organise. Et bien entendu, on va continuer à investir. On va travailler sur des briques technologiques que nous n'avons pas aujourd'hui et qu'il faut absolument qu'on développe. Je pense en particulier aux réutilisables. C'est quelque chose sur lequel on va travailler. À côté de ça, on va aussi travailler beaucoup. On l'a déjà beaucoup fait. Le CNES a été vraiment moteur pour ça. Non seulement en travaillant avec nos grands primes que j'ai mentionnés précédemment, mais aussi en travaillant sur les nouveaux acteurs, sur le New Space, sur toutes ces jeunes entreprises qui sont en train de naître à la frontière entre le numérique, le digital et et le spatial. Et donc, c'est des capacités de développer des constellations de petits satellites qui vont être capables de faire de l'observation de la Terre, qui vont être capables de faire de l'IoT, de faire des télécoms pour des coûts qui sont très très bas. Et ça, c'est vraiment un enjeu majeur pour tous nos pays, parce que c'est directement utile pour les citoyens, hein, que ce soit dans votre GPS pour vous guider, ou pour demain savoir à quel moment il va falloir arroser votre champ, ou pour être capable de monitorer vos activités de pêche quand vous êtes pêcheur. Toutes ces activités, toutes ces données satellitaires, elles sont absolument. Voilà, donc je crois que vraiment on est à une espèce de frontière où le monde bascule où le monde du spatial est en train de bouger, pas de basculer intégralement, parce que la vérité c'est qu'on continuera quand on fera de la science, ce sera toujours un rôle d'agence très classique, je crois, mais en tout cas sur beaucoup d'autres secteurs, on est en train de basculer dans un monde où l'entreprise va vraiment avoir un rôle majeur et un rôle moteur, et où les États vont plutôt passer des commandes, plutôt réaliser comme ils l'ont fait précédemment. Ça, c'est le premier point. Un monde qui est quand même malgré tout un monde qui s'ouvre, et avec plusieurs acteurs, avec de nombreux acteurs qui sont autour de la table du spatial, et où il faudra construire des alliances. Et évidemment, la France a toujours été très ouverte justement à ce type d'alliance et au travail avec des partenaires qui sont nombreux et parfois très divers. Voilà, donc c'est un monde passionnant qui s'ouvre encore à nous et pour les prochaines années.
So thank you very much. So we can switch back a little bit to English.
Sure.
But I would like to ask you another very simple, I like simple questions, you know. So a number of times you mentioned European space policy or politics. Can we really speak of a European space policy?
Well, at least there is a European ambition on space. That's very true. There is also a set of regulations on how you build space programs, how you make them real. And space policy, yes, I think there is a true ambition from the European Commission today, and especially Commissaire Breton is really deeply involved into this policy. He believes that...
he is French.
Sorry?
He is French.
I think so, yes. Yeah, he's French. But I think it's shared...
France and Germany, are we exactly along the same lines?
Well, it depends on depending on the topics. It's very true that, well, Germany is very ambitious on space. It's true. I think that it's public. They are very ambitious in space. So there is a kind, of course, of internal competition within Europe. This has always been the case between Italy, Germany, and France, and it has to be for the very good of Europe. I really think that there is room for that. I think that we don't have to compete on very, very expensive programs like heavy launchers. It does not mean that they don't have to be competitive, but I think that we have to organize competition because they are very, very costly. So let's not be crazy and let's not compete directly in between our European nations. But for instance, on smaller launchers or on several different kinds of technology for satellites, competition is already there, it's strong, and it's for the best, huh? Because I mean, so typically having this kind of competition is good for our traditional industry.
Thank you very much. Madam Minister, when we speak of alliances, I think this idea of alliances is very important. After that, I'd like to come back to the two superpowers. But how do you, in your case, choose your alliances? How do you choose your partners?
It's as simple as based on the objectives of the program that we're on, and what the partner brings to the table and what we bring to the table. A lot of our partnerships in terms of development have been based on mutual development of both of the entities. We work heavily in integrating our teams within the teams of the entities that we work on. So it's always based on objectives.
Yes, but this is, if I may say, a technical answer. But of course, these issues are also fundamentally political. So this is why I repeat my question. If beyond the economic, technological considerations, what are the political aspects of the major choices?
So space at the moment, and as was just mentioned earlier, access to space is very important, and ensuring the sustainability of space is very important. And that's usually played in the global policy forums in terms of how are we ensuring that we are sustainably accessing space, so we're not cluttering space and cluttering the ways that we're using the space. This is conversations that are happening across the board, across different nations. And then the second one is how do you ensure that you have access to space for different nations that want to access for different reasons. You mentioned Earth observation. Earth observation is very important for all of us. It touches on every single person's daily lives, whether we know it or not. And therefore ensuring that nations have access to space. And that doesn't mean access to launching to space, even access to data coming from space is what we use and what we discuss on an international front. So those are the different aspects that come to consideration when you're talking about international partnerships. On the policy front, it's very important, and this conversation over the course of the next 10 years will become more important, and new alliances, I think, will form based on the methodology that we think we should proceed with regards to access to space.
So before I enlarge the discussion, maybe you wanted to say something on this question, no?
No, I just want to mention that of course, we have a strong alliance between the two governments on space policy, because we have a lot of joint activities between the Emirates and France. So we have people from Toulouse coming back and forth to
Thank you, Raj. So before I enlarge the discussion with the participants, if we look much ahead, let's say the next 20 years or something like that, I think nobody knows if any human mission on Mars can succeed, because for human reasons, probably more than for technological reasons, of course, but we can dream. I don't know, Madam Minister, since you are very young, maybe you will be a candidate sometime to visit Mars, and I hope you will come back in good physical conditions. But
that's not a given. Huh? I mean,
that's the big question. But there is another question, more political and less romantic about the long term, which is the following one. If the rivalry between the United States and China develops over the next 20 years, which is very likely, of course, and beyond, there is at least a theoretical possibility of two disconnected cyber spaces, one which would be American dominated, the other one which would be China dominated. And my question is, this is not sure, but it is a more credible, more likely event than the human mission in Mars in this time span. So my question is, to the two of you, first, do you recognize the legitimacy of the question? Point number one. From a political, but even from a technological viewpoint here, that is to have totally disconnected cyber spheres. And if that became a reality, what consequences would it have on the rest of us? Or to put it perhaps in a slightly different way, is there a place for a third, for a third choice, that is not to be trapped? This is something that we have discussed in various ways in the last 2 days in different fields. But would there be room for others not to be forced to choose between the two? We start with you, Madam.
So I'll take you back to the previous question that you asked. So your question, I think the reasoning that you've gone through is a legitimate source of perhaps concern for many nations around the world. Looking at it from a access perspective, that's where we can have the third option becoming the normal. And you spoke about the UAE's relationship with France. A lot of it is actually based on a common understanding of how to utilize space. If we continue such collaborations between different nations, and if you continue ensuring that new entrants that want to enter into the space domain are actually able to enter into it, are not prohibited by either very stringent technological requirements under the guise of sustainability of space, or very stringent requirements in terms of inhibitions in terms of access to, for example, launch site access or access to various orbits in space. If the conversation is kept within ensuring access to space, we will get the third option where you will continue to get this fostered collaboration in space. The other aspect that's more allowing this to be more reasonable is going back to the point of the entrance of the private sector. And your point is well noted, where it is supported by government. The private sector today is supported by government either by demand creation or by providing subsidies or by providing contracts. But if you increase the demand for space from other sectors, you enable a portion of the space sector to grow and to be dependent business to business, and it no longer becomes a government to business relationship. That increases the number of actors that enter into the space sector. And by increasing the number of actors that enter the space sector, by default, you're going to increase business-to-business relationship, government to businesses in other countries' relationships, and so on. You increase the number of players. You remove the dominance. And you make the name of the game in space, the norm of the name of the game in space, to be collaboration, cooperation, and healthy competition, like what you described exists today in Europe. And that's how you're able to move towards the third option, which I think is the beneficial option to all players on the ground today.
Well, thank you very much for this elaborate answer, Philippe.
Yeah, perhaps to answer your question on is there a risk that you have on one side a US-led cyberspace environment and another one on the Chinese side? Yes, there is a risk. And I think it's very important, at least for Europe, to be there. It's crucial for our autonomy. It's crucial for business, and we really need to develop at least. I'm thinking of the telecommunication constellation of satellites in low Earth orbit. This is very important because this is a component which is key for the future of telecommunication. It will be a simple way to provide internet everywhere on the globe with real time, so very short delay of response. And this project is really, I think, a cornerstone of the European policy in space. This is something which is really pushed by the European Commission, and it's really key. And I believe it will really happen. It will happen because this constellation, so of course there is the constellation of Elon Musk, Starlink, which is already there, but there is also OneWeb, which is an European and UK-based constellation, but and also other players. And I am pretty sure that you will have very soon a big European constellation for internet. This is really fundamental.
Well, thank you very much. Now we have a little bit of time. I think this is Karl Kaiser, who is German and American. But I would say 75 German, 70% German, 30% American.
Listening to the two of you, I am struck by a possible interesting parallel. As we all remember, and Ifri and other European institutes did studies in the 70s and 80s on this, at the beginning, France was the clearly leading space power in Europe, far ahead of the others. And it pulled the others along. And I still remember very well when the French had to put a lot of pressure and persuasion on the Germans to make them move into this area, because only by being a group you have sufficient resources because it's very expensive to do these things. But there's also a political motive behind them, as we all know. And Madam Minister, it seems to me, aren't you now going possibly the way France once did, being the leader of a future coalition of partners, possibly in the region, in order to gather enough resources to do more than you can do nationally as a country alone? So that would be one question. And the other one would be, do you see a possibility that, like Europe, you may move to an area which is not just only civil, but possibly for other uses? Observation satellites, for example. Europe's doing that, which can be used for civil purposes, but also for example, control of arms control agreements, or possibly even military purposes. So, two questions.
Please, Madam.
So on the topic of the first question with regards to the collaboration within the region, like you said, space is really expensive. And the riskier it is, you spoke about constellation, for example, of communications, that's a paradigm shift. So we're at a time where any program that you take is riskier, therefore more costly in some instances. You're creating paradigm shifts in sectors. So the Earth observation sector of imaging Earth in various wavelengths has been transformed over the course of the last 10 years. The next 10 years, we'll see a full transformation of communication systems. And I think navigations will come in sometime in the next decade. So you're talking about entire paradigm shifts that requires you to reinvest in infrastructure, reinvest in methodologies of development, and so on. It's natural for coalitions to be formed. Because like you said, you need to offset risk, and you need to have various resources to create the right impact that you'll have. It's a natural progression for a region to move towards working, and it's not about force, it's about the mutual benefit, which is what happened in Europe. It's mutual benefit that pushes this development forward. There will be competition, but it will be healthy competition to further advancement and development. So that's on the front of cooperation. When you're talking about utilizing space systems, yes, there are civilian uses of space. Space started as a military endeavor. What we're looking at the moment is economic drive and economic development for the UAE's purposes, and that's where a lot of resources and investment is going in. Do countries utilize space for various uses? Yes, it's normal, it's natural, everyone does it. But the primary purpose will remain from the space sector in the UAE for the economic development.
Okay, so now I will take three questions. Three. You are identified. Yeah, I saw you. Wait a minute. Wait a second. Okay. I suggest that we take the three questions together and you answer, not to be too late. And I start with Farid Yassin.
Questions that is very biased. I used to be a scientist, and money for science is scarce.
Parle dans le micro, dans le micro.
Money for science is scarce. People fight for it. There's competition. There are areas that are very trendy, like space exploration. There's particle physics, which you mentioned. There's quantum computing. The topic I want to mention here is fusion. Why? Because we're all under the threat of climate change. And one of the silver bullets that is being talked about as a solution to the problem of the energy that we face is fusion. Europe is very active. I'm sure you face some competition for the funds that you get from people involved in fusion. And in fact, either the new international reactor is being built in Cadarache, France itself. My question to you is, are you being affected by this new focus on funding towards addressing climate change? And the second question that I have has to do with the involvement of the private sector. Most of the projects involving fusion are publicly funded. But now in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, we are seeing private investors building tokamaks or equivalent machines at a much lower cost in the hope of finding a much cheaper, quicker silver bullet. Is there a similar project in France or elsewhere in Europe? And if there isn't, why?
Thank you very much. Serge Sur et Daniel Andler. Serge Sur.
Merci beaucoup. Nous avons surtout parlé des aspects technologiques, économiques, scientifiques de l'utilisation de l'espace.
Parle un peu plus dans...
Et il est évident que ce sont des aspects qui aujourd'hui sont dominants et qui sont compliqués par la multiplication du nombre des acteurs spatiaux, qui d'ailleurs, cette multiplication encourage la coopération, tout au moins pour ce qui est des activités pacifiques ou des activités civiles, lesquelles sont aujourd'hui dominantes. Mais je me souviens que lorsque j'étais aux Nations Unies, la grande question de l'espace, c'était la course aux armements dans l'espace. Et la question de l'arms control, à laquelle faisait allusion tout à l'heure Karl Kaiser. C'était l'IDS, c'était le grand débat à ce sujet. Alors aujourd'hui, je crois que les utilisations militaires n'ont pas diminué. Et le spatial reste toujours déterminant pour les communications, pour la surveillance, pour les opérations militaires, pour la dissuasion nucléaire. Et le traité de 67, qui reste aujourd'hui la charte de l'espace, qui contient certains principes qui sont des principes simples et des principes qui ont jusqu'à présent été respectés. La question que je pose aux experts, c'est ce traité est-il aujourd'hui suffisant? Parce qu'il est essentiellement consacré aux questions militaires. Il est très précis en ce qui concerne la non-prolifération des armes dans l'espace, et même l'interdiction de placer des armes de destruction massive dans l'espace, mais il est très elliptique sur le reste. Alors, est-ce que ce traité est aujourd'hui suffisant pour les utilisateurs, ou est-ce qu'il demande à être transformé parce qu'il a été en fait conclu entre les États-Unis et l'URSS, et il est possible qu'il ne réponde plus exactement aux besoins des utilisations actuelles? C'est là-dessus que je serais très heureux d'avoir le point de vue des panélistes.
Merci Serge. Donc, la dernière question, Daniel Andler.
I'll be brief because the two previous speakers gave excellent questions. So, first of all, I'm not entirely reassured by the fact that right now the non-military activities seem to predominate. I wonder whether when push comes to shove, the military won't sort of take hold of the field and make it go in the direction it wants. So that's my first question. My second question is about cluttering. I've heard that there's a big problem of satellites cluttering the space and how that problem will be solved. And the third one has a little bit to do with the fact that there are limited resources. And I was in science, I was wondering whether, especially Philippe Baptiste, thought that we had the right sort of young, inventive engineers and scientists to really fuel progress in the space field, or whether we should start thinking about new ways of training our young engineers and scientists. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So I would like to give you the last word. So I give the floor to Philippe.
Merci beaucoup. Chacune des questions mériterait un débat long. Peut-être quelques éléments. Est-ce qu'on sent une compétition, par exemple, entre les questions autour de la fusion? Switch to English. Do we feel that there is some kind of competition of resources, of funding between a research program on energy, like fusion, for instance, and space? I would say the answer is no, not directly. And typically, I would say that the countries that invest the most in either program also invest the most in the other one, because basically those countries are the countries that do believe in technology and do believe in the fact that the technology can really change the world. So I'm not really scared by this competition of funding. I would say it really goes in the same direction. Just perhaps a word on militarization of space. This is, of course, a big issue. I just want, if I just perhaps focus question is very wide, but if I just want to focus on launcher, which is only a subset, but today I think that we have worldwide something like 250 companies, either small ones, startups, or larger ones, that want to develop a mini launcher. So a mini launcher is really very close to a ballistic missile. So the question of proliferation and the question of how do you manage this technology, I mean, of course, the rules are the same, and all big countries will do their best to monitor what happened and to forbid some kind of loss of technologies to avoid this kind of bad usage of launchers. But still, the question will be there, because when you have so many actors who are developing technologies everywhere in the world, I mean, this question will be really key. Again, I go very fast because we are out of time, but the question of debris and the question of how do we manage pollution in space is a key question. It's a key question, especially in low Earth orbit, so the orbit which is very close to Earth, and where you have an incredible increase of the number of satellites there. It's an exponential law. It goes very, very fast, and we will be in trouble. The question is not to know whether yes or no we will be in trouble. The question is to know when we will be in trouble. Trouble meaning collision, and collision meaning that you have much more debris and the probability of another collision, which is heavier again. So the question is, how do we regulate space? At some point, this question has to come. And I think that we have limited choice. We have to think about that. And we cannot only rely on goodwills of private actors. There has to be some kind of global strategy, worldwide strategy on this question. Perhaps finally, to answer the question on private investors, and if I can reformulate the question was basically, where are they in Europe? I would say that we have limited number of people, of billionaires who do invest in space, at least in France. I'm afraid I know none of them right now, but I hope they will come very soon. Still, we have a lot of companies that invest in space, and we have many new, I'm not talking only about Airbus and Thales, which are giants, and which are key players in space, but there are also new ones. Let me mention, for instance, CNES, which is a young company which manufactures small satellites for many different usage, especially IoT. It's very young, it's very dynamic, it comes with very low price, so I'm pretty sure it will be very successful soon. Well, there are many of them. Still, I really believe that we have to put much more effort in this new space sector, because it will really boost space technology all over the society, and it's a huge economic growth too. So we will invest a lot there.
Thank you very much, Madam.
I think we touched, if I got this correctly, the questions were across 3 different streams. One with regards to militarizing space and proliferation in space. It's about each actor being responsible for what we've all signed on. There will be more and more companies up and coming around the world, like you were mentioning, and it's about how the local regulations reflect the intentions of the countries in terms of proliferation of space. On the aspect of the private sector, I think it was specific to Europe, but for the private sector itself, what it gives us and what we've seen that it gives us is new innovations, because these companies are up and starting, and they develop things different than it's typically developed in agencies that have been around for 40 and 50 years. Space, I think, is as innovative as it is, it's a highly indoctrined mechanism of design and development, especially in larger institutions, and a lot of it is inherited from failed missions. There are policies and procedures that some entities are following that are from failed missions in the 70s. as an example. When you get new entrants into space, be it countries that are entering newly into space or companies that are entering new space, they don't have those baggage of what I call relationships that went wrong. They can start a fresh page, and therefore they're able to innovate and development. Therefore, there needs to be a nice balance between the two. What we need to see in terms of investment, I know there's a big hype in investment. Parts of it are hype, parts of it are real. What we need to play as space agencies is ensuring the sustainability of the real investment to carry fruit over the course of the next decade, because it's the way that we're able to develop new mechanisms of retraining engineers and new mechanisms of thinking in terms of space systems development. We can find better products and services coming to space, and we can find a solution to the clutter that we have in low Earth orbit. Because what we can bring to the table today is discussions on a policy front and an international policy front. The real innovation will come in ensuring that we're accessing space, finding out early if there's collisions, but more importantly, understanding better how do you, in a low-cost manner, declutter space. And that's an innovation that will come from the private sector, and I don't think we have concepts, but no solutions that are real for those. And I hope I did answer the 3 questions, but that's what I got from those.
Well, thank you very, very much for this, I think, a very interesting and stimulating discussion. I can assure you that in the coming years, the issues of technology, space in particular, will play an increasing role in this World Policy Conference. But, World Policy Conference, there is the word policy. And it seems to me that we are, I would say, at the beginning of a collective reflection on how policy should be approached. We have spoken a lot in other sessions of the idea of flexible alliances, cooperation, all that in a world that we want, all of us, the middle powers, to remain as open as possible, but I like to call reasonably open. And there is a lot of work to do to become more operational in these extremely exciting fields. So I can tell you that for myself, I am not a candidate for a trip in the extra atmosphere, even if I were a billionaire, and even less a candidate for Mars. When the day comes, I will be elsewhere. Thank you very much indeed.